Thanks, Carrie. So I'm going to keep this kind of informal and move around. This is kind of typically the way I usually teach, and I don't like to use a microphone because you can hear me just fine. So what I'm going to do today is Carrie had kind of asked, and we've had discussions back and forth on email about kind of what you guys wanted to hear and what would be interesting. Really, you wanted some kind of general history of the Valley. And one of the things that I'll do, though, is if you guys have a question, or if we digress, or if we sideline onto something else, that's perfectly okay. We don't have to stick to the PowerPoint necessarily. My assumption is also that most of you are familiar kind of with the area, but maybe not all that familiar with the history of the area. So in that sense, I want to kind of start diving in there. And by the way, I'll start with the first slide here. You notice I call this New Mexico's Upper Peninsula. That's the way I always characterize. I think I need to, at some point I should trademark that because I think this is something I kind of designed, sort of came up with years ago. Let me just tell you a quick little vignette about the way I do this. I am, by the way, my background, we mentioned I'm from Nebraska. I grew up near the Black Hills of South Dakota up there at Chadron, Nebraska. My dad was a historian, but we spent all the time going around the country. I did my undergrad at University of Kansas and did my doctoral and master's degree down at University of New Mexico and ended up here at Adams State. I teach an American West course. That's kind of my specialty. I also, by the way, another interesting little sideline, I work with the NCAA. I do a lot of sports history and I'm actually chair some of their stuff, some of their national committees. But I teach a Colorado history course. And one of the things that I always wanted to do when I teach Colorado history was I wanted the students to do something hands-on first day, not just sit there and listen to me. So what I did is I would always put the student in groups and I'd put up a big topographical map. And actually I'll show you the map that I used to use on this. Used to put something like that up. And I'd say, look, if Colorado were a country, what would be the states of Colorado and what would be the capitals? And this would force the students to kind of start thinking about the state historically and what makes it different. I mean, the fact that Colorado has Springfield, Colorado, which was like the heart of the Dust Bowl, and it's got Aspen in the same state is kind of significant, right? Worlds apart from one another. So what the students would do is they would start kind of dividing up the state. And what's fascinating is over the years I've done this, the students will do different things. What they'll do is they might subdivide the plains and decide that, northeast Colorado along the South Platte River would be one kind of state, or that the Arkansas Valley would be kind of another state. They do different things with the mountain regions, but here's what's really fascinating. Over the years, this has been it's almost predictable now. They'll always do one thing that they agree on. They will always draw the San Luis Valley as its own state with Alamosa as a capital. And they do this with almost predictable regularity now. So a lot of times I do have students who are from the San Luis Valley. People from the San Luis Valley certainly feel that distinctiveness. They feel that they are different from the rest of the state. They also feel they're isolated from the rest of the state, and we kind of are, by the way. Especially in the wintertime, we have to cross a pass to get out of the valley, and that's no small thing. Got to go over Levita, got to go over Wolf Creek, Cochetopa, Poncha Pass. You got to do one of those things. But I think that, especially for the students from the valley here, they do feel that the San Luis Valley is its own very unique space. People coming from the outside, though, also share that. And that's why I call it the Upper Peninsula of New Mexico, because it really is. I mean, I spent a lot of years working in New Mexico. I used to work for a lot of years over at Philmont National Scout Ranch in New Mexico, and my son's been working there for the last several years. And I'm down in Albuquerque going to school. And I can tell you that the San Luis Valley does feel like New Mexico. We're very Latino, for one thing. I measure our connection with New Mexico by one most important thing, the presence of really, really good green chili. So I say that jokingly, but I'm not actually really kidding about that. We take this shit seriously down here, sorry. Down in New Mexico. And the people from the valley here, it's funny, I mentioned my wife lives up in Denver and I go back and forth on the weekends and holidays and stuff. And, we're always kind of snobbish about trying to find good green chili around Denver. It typically doesn't exist up there like it does down here. But we're also, if you also look in terms of geography, note the bottom of the valley there. There really is no bottom of the valley. The valley just goes straight into New Mexico. So there's no natural barriers between here and there. That's why I think the San Luis Valley has to be understood in that kind of particular context on that. Let's talk about some kind of broad background history here. I'm just gonna, Carrie, you had indicated that about some of this, about the Native American background. I'll spend a little time on that, then I'll kind of get to some Spanish, and then I'll get to what I think to be the most important determinant of how the valley looks the way it does today, railroads. That happens to be one of my kind of bailiwicks and major areas of specialty on that. But the one thing about Colorado too, the Native American background of Colorado is really quite different. Here's the one thing I would point out about Colorado today and Native Americans, and that is there are none. Note all the states around us and look at the presence of reservations. Again, South Dakota, South Dakota is like a big chunk of South Dakota are reservations. Wyoming, Arizona, a huge piece of Arizona is the Navajo, the Diné reservation. New Mexico, reservations everywhere. Utah, but not Colorado. Why? Think about that for a second. Actually, it has to do a little bit, it has really a lot to do with mineral rushes. The thing about gold rushes, silver rushes, all that kind of stuff, they almost always meant very bad things for Native Americans. And it so happens that because of those rushes to Colorado pushed out the Native Americans to the states around, to Wyoming and Utah and New Mexico primarily, fairly early on. There's only really 2 reservations in Colorado today, and they're both right on the border, and they're both pretty small. One is along the southern border there over by Bayfield, and then the other one is the Ute Mountain Reservation out by, kind of past Cortez there. And that's it. But that's one of the things that I do think makes Colorado kind of distinctive in all of this today as well. This is the Ute territory. When we talk about different tribes, obviously I have to look at the landscape of Colorado and really kind of divide it into 2, the Great Plains and the mountain areas. The Great Plains areas, the very different kinds of Native American cultures that grew up out there. I grew up about 50 miles from Wounded Knee, South Dakota, so I'm kind of used to the Lakota, or the Arapaho and the Cheyenne, northern and southern Cheyennes, and some of those. I won't deal with them so much because they're a ways away from us, but the Utes were kind of a unique group because they occupied the mountain regions. That's going to shape their lifestyle. The Utes are distinct in quite a few different ways. One is they spoke a Shoshonean language, which is typical more among tribes up in the Pacific Northwest. You don't see it as often down here. The Utes also had kind of a distinctive look to them. They tended to be darker complected, for example, and tended to be a little different kind of body shape, a little shorter, a little whiter in terms of their overall makeup. That's just a generalization, but they were kind of distinctive. But what they did was they had adapted their lifestyle to the mountain areas here and living a lifestyle that would kind of work out. By the way, this right here shows you the progression of the loss of Ute lands. And you can kind of see that early on, and I'll show you another map that'll kind of cover this. Early on, the Utes pretty much dominated the mountain regions, and this including up into here as well. But they especially dominated the southwestern quadrant of Colorado. And you can see the rapid land loss that they had there over just really a couple of decades. This is, of course, the story of Native Americans throughout the West in general. But it's especially the story of Native Americans who happen to have the curse of living near mineral wealth, where this would always come in there. There's a picture of a Ute. This is probably from about probably about 1880s or so. I mostly use that picture to give you some sense for it, and also it's a very nice, clear picture. It was from, I think, History Colorado is where I got that one from. And then there's a kind of another view of the Utes. I'm going to circle back to the Utes in here in just a minute to talk about their history. But I do want to talk about the Spanish here for a second. And the Spanish are ones that, we have to deal with that. That's an important part of the legacy of this area. I was teaching this stuff to my class the other day, and I said, I think we need to think about what we understand about the Spanish here in the Southwest for one important reason here. We live in the San Luis Valley. We live between the Sangre de Cristos and the San Juan Mountains. We're on the Rio Grande River. It's obviously all Spanish names around this area, which tells us the Spanish were kind of important. I'll skip past. By the way, I do like to also, real quick sidebar on this. The Spanish are one of those groups that are really, I think, kind of misunderstood sometimes in American history. We tend to teach American history starting with Jamestown, starting when white English people showed up and started settling, and it seems like that's what, and that isn't a very important, let's face it, that does shape the country very importantly, but that ignores the stories of all these other groups. And the Spanish actually were very active in the American Southwest. They essentially dominated the American Southwest for almost twice as long as the Americans have to this point. So they put an important stamp on there. I point out these two guys, Ponce de Leon and Coronado, though, because usually those are two names that my students typically know. Anybody know what Ponce de Leon's famous for? For the Fountain of Youth, looking for the Fountain of Youth in Florida. I always joke that, and it turns out, all he had to do was go off of I-95 just out of St. Augustine, Florida, and you can pay about $20 to go drink from the Fountain of Youth. Just kidding. Florida's known for its roadside attractions, all these famous tourist traps down there, the biggest of which we call Disney World. But keep that in mind a second. And Coronado, what's he known for? That would be Pizarro, and Cortez conquered the Aztec Empire. Coronado was famous for, in about the 1530s and 1540s, after they had been in the Americas for several decades, they did this kind of thorough sort of trying to understand what's called the Northern Mystery, which is everything north of Mexico, by exploring. De Soto exploring the southeast was part of that. Juan de Cabrillo sailing up the Pacific coast was part of that, and Coronado kind of went up the middle. He's famous, though, for looking for gold and actually ends up searching for gold in the middle of Kansas. Now, he was drawn out there really by a Pueblo Indian who decided that, wait a minute, these guys are bad news for us. Let me get them out of here. And he took them out to Quivira out in the middle of Kansas. We know that there's ridiculous. There'd be no gold out there. My point about this, though, and this is something just to think about, what we think about the Spanish is that the Spanish were particularly foolish. They were, chasing myths, essentially. Or in the case of like Coronado and Cortez, they were also brutal towards the Native Americans. Now, those are not entirely wrong, but there's also that's the basis of what we call the Black Legend. And the Black Legend is this negative view of the Spanish peoples or people of Hispanic background. And I would argue that that's the source of a lot of anti-Hispanic prejudice in the 19th and into the 20th century. I go back to where, look how long it took New Mexico and Arizona to become states. They languished for 62 years as territories. It took most states about Colorado, 15 years from territory to statehood. That's about what it was for most of the West, except for New Mexico and Arizona. They had a different thing. Why? It was dominated by Latinos. And the idea was that we have to make sure it had sufficient Anglo control before those would become states. But the fact was that the Spanish came over way earlier, and they came over with a different mindset. They were medieval Spaniards that came over. The English that came over in 1607, or the French that started settling, that 100 years between about 1500 and 1600, a lot changed in Europe. And so we have to kind of treat the Spanish a little bit differently that way. Talk about the San Luis Valley here. The Spanish end up settling. They first settled New Mexico in 1598, and then they settled Texas closer to 1700, almost 100 years later. And then another 70 years past that, they settled California. So they settled these kind of, it's like three fingers of settlement, right, going northward. One of the things that I don't think people realize about the Spanish is that Americans later will look at the Spanish and say, they weren't very effective. They weren't effective colonizers. They didn't put down durable colonies that grew in size like what happened in Jamestown or in Massachusetts or in Pennsylvania. And so there's a tendency to sort of disregard the Spanish. What people don't understand is that the Spaniards settled these territories for one very important reason: to keep other Europeans out. Every time they sensed a European threat, they moved north and put up a colony as like a picket fence to keep the others out. New Mexico had to do with the sailings of Sir Francis Drake in the late 1500s. He was sailing around, he was pirating on Spanish ships, and then he ended up over in the Pacific, and they thought he had found a quick way through North America. It turns out he had gone down around South America like everybody else did at the time. But that forced him to go ahead and put up New Mexico as an outpost. And then in the late 1600s, Sieur de La Salle, the Frenchman, put down a temporary colony in Texas. Didn't last long, and the colonists were not happy with La Salle when they realized where they had settled. They were supposed to settle at the mouth of the Mississippi, at what would be kind of near modern day New Orleans, and they blew off course, ended up in Texas. The French colonists expressed their displeasure with La Salle by murdering him. But the point was that there was this little fledgling French colony in Texas, and that caused the Spanish to go across Texas, put up a string of forts and a string of missions across Texas. And then later, in the 1750s and 60s, the Russians, believe it or not, we don't think about the Russians much in American history, do we? They were coming down the Pacific coast. So then the Spaniards decided, we better get out again, and they started settling California. So those three main colonies, New Mexico, Texas, California, were really put up not to be flourishing, populated, growing colonies. They were put up to keep other Europeans out. They were like an early warning sign for other Europeans. Also misunderstood, I think, about the Spanish. One of the things, this is Juan Bautista de Anza, who was the governor of New Mexico at a later period. I'm going to skip past a lot of important stuff. By the way, you might know that the other thing that happened in New Mexico in 1680, after the Spanish had been there for nearly 100 years, was you had the most, and it's a huge event, the most successful Native American uprising in American history. The Pueblo Indians completely threw out the Spanish. They completely eliminated the colony in New Mexico for 12 years. They rose up on a single day. They killed a good chunk of the colonists. They killed almost all of the religious clerics. Clearly there's issues over religion there that we could get into. And New Mexico ceased to exist as a Spanish colony. It wasn't until 1692 that Don Diego de Vargas came back and reconquered New Mexico. Later, 100 years later or so, here comes Juan Bautista de Anza. The San Luis Valley was always kind of a peripheral shadowy area for the Spanish. There really wasn't, first of all, there wasn't a whole lot of reason to come up settle in the valley. For one thing, the valley was dominated by the Utes. The Utes were somebody that, on one hand, could be a threat to Spanish settlements because they were raiders. Once they got the horse, they became, and they were semi-nomadic, so they became raiders. The other thing is that they were also traders, though. They could trade with some of those northern outposts, like Taos, for example, on that. Well, Bautista de Anza was having problems with, and this is the other thing that I always like to kind of reorient people's thinking to. It wasn't just about Europeans coming out and then eventually crushing Indians. You had other rising empires. As the Americans are coming westward, out on the Great Plains, you had two ascendant empires themselves, meaning rising empires. One was the Lakota up to the north, and the other was the Comanche down in the south, especially based on kind of West Texas area, kind of that panhandle area of Texas. And the Comanches had long been a real rival to the Spanish. And at one point, they would send out these parties that would raid sometimes they would raid the colonies, those settlements in New Mexico. There was a great chief by the name of Cuerno Verde. And Cuerno Verde had brought up, he was kind of a threat to the Spanish in this area. So you know what de Anza did? He kind of had an idea that Cuerno Verde was out there on the plains in southern Colorado, kind of along the Front Range. And he used the San Luis Valley as kind of a thoroughfare. He came up through the valley, headed up north, over Poncha Pass, ended up coming down the Arkansas River and coming in behind Cuerno Verde. And a famous battle took place near Colorado City. If you go on the interstate where there's that huge hill that goes up, there's actually a rest stop there, Cuerno Verde rest stop. And it was not too far from there that Cuerno Verde was killed in battle with Juan Bautista de Anza. But for the most part, though, you know, the valley was really just, like I said, it was a zone for them. It was kind of a zone of contact with the Utes, and occasionally it would be a highway for them to go up and down. American arrival comes in 1806 and 1807. This is Zebulon Pike. Everybody knows Pike because, of course, we've got a big, huge mountain named after him on the Front Range. And Pike has an interesting thing. You know, the Louisiana Purchase was done in 1803 by Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson, one of the things that Jefferson, and incidentally, I'll just digress for a second. One of the things that I've done a lot in my years, I have operated as a tour guide. I had grants for a long time, and then I started getting hired by all these, particularly educational groups, to do tours of the East. So Washington, D.C. and Boston, I've done like at least 15, 20 tours of each of those places. I also used to work for the History Channel. I wrote Civil War history for them, so I've done a lot with the Civil War and Civil War battlefield tours down in New Mexico, down in Virginia. And I used to take people to Monticello a lot. And of course, Monticello, everybody been to Monticello by any chance? Really fascinating. It's a beautiful home. Of course, it's very Jeffersonian, right? Jefferson was a Renaissance man. He was interested in everything. Interested in nature and philosophy and political philosophy, all that stuff. But Monticello was really kind of an example of a lot of this. When he was president and after the purchase of Louisiana, he decided to do something very practical, go out and explore it. So most famously, he sent Lewis and Clark up to the north there to head up the Missouri River and head out to the Pacific Northwest, partly to make friends with the Indians. Lewis and Clark didn't do a very good job of that because they killed a few Indians along the way and created a real hostility, particularly among the Blackfeet. And so he had Lewis and Clark exploring that area. Then he had Zebulon Pike sort of exploring the other part of the Louisiana Purchase. Here's the Louisiana Purchase right here. And so he sent Pike out to do this number. Pike comes across the plains, traipses around. He goes up and actually discovers the headwaters of the source of the Arkansas River up by Leadville. And then he comes down. He actually makes an attempt, by the way, to climb Pikes Peak. And apparently he made the comment, he and some of his party decided to try to climb it. They didn't make it. And he predicted that it would never be climbed, which is really funny because, of course, now we drive to the top of Pikes Peak. It gets thousands and thousands of visitors. And then he does something really interesting. He comes down into the San Luis Valley, and he crosses over right behind the sand dunes, comes into the San Luis Valley, and he goes down to right near Sanford. And he puts up a stockade for the winter. First of all, I question Pike's judgment to decide to winter in the San Luis Valley. Anybody that's been around this area knows, and by the way, I've been here since 2000. I will tell you that, this place is way warmer than it was when I first got here. When I first got here, we routinely had minus 30 temperatures for multiple nights every winter, minus 20 a lot, minus 10 almost all the time. Now we're not really getting down much below minus 10 anymore. There has definitely been a climate change here in the valley since I've lived here in the last quarter century or so. But it was super cold, usually back then. And Pike put up this stockade down there, and then he eventually gets arrested by the Spanish because he's in Spanish territory. But again, I won't go into a whole lot of detail about this. This is a fascinating story. It turns out his commander was a guy by the name of James Wilkinson. James Wilkinson was the Army commander for the United States west of the Appalachian Mountains. And Wilkinson had dispatched Pike on this particular adventure, really at the behest of Thomas Jefferson. We now know that the Spanish knew that Pike was coming. They knew Pike was going to be exploring around out there, and they were just waiting for him. And sure enough, they come up and they arrest him here in the San Luis Valley. They basically take him down into Mexico. That's why you see that red line going way down there. Incidentally, this is really fascinating. We now know that there was a sort of a double agent involved in all of this. We found this out about 100 years later, around 1900. Archives down in Mexico City revealed this. It turns out there was somebody on the payroll in the United States military who was essentially giving the Spanish information about what the United States was doing. That person, James Wilkinson, the commander of the West. Can you imagine that? Can you imagine a few years back, General Petraeus over in Afghanistan, giving information to the Taliban on what the United States was doing? That's exactly what this was. It's pretty remarkable. Incidentally, it's also been understood, though, that here's one thing you have to remember. There was no guarantee the United States was really going to survive as a nation or even ever expand out. The idea of American nationalism was not a well-developed concept, so we might see Wilkinson as a traitor, but at the same time, most people were not, very few people called themselves Americans back in the early 1800s at this time. They called themselves Pennsylvanians or Virginians or whatever they happened to be from, and the idea of being an American wasn't really that well developed at that time. Let's move ahead a little bit here. San Luis Valley then, how do we get settlements actually here that are not Native Americans? Really you got to pop up here to about the 1840s and 1850s. An issue I'm going to come back to here in a few minutes is going to be land grants. In the 1830s and 40s, the now Mexican authorities, remember that in 1821, Spain is ousted and Mexico becomes independent. And now Mexican authorities from the 1820s on, they start to get a little concerned. They're getting concerned because once they became independent, they opened up the Santa Fe Trail for trade with the Missouri Valley. And remember, Santa Fe is a heck of a long way from anything else in Mexico. It was easier to trade with the Missouri Valley, and so the Santa Fe Trail, boom, 1821, pretty much opens up. All of a sudden, the Mexicans start getting a little bit nervous because wherever Americans show up, they seem to be disrupting things, and they seem to be getting their commercial hooks into things, most notably Texas. And of course, what's the story of Texas? Enough Americans flood in there that all of a sudden in the 1830s, they have a revolt and Texas becomes its own country for a little while. Same thing with New Mexico. In places like Taos and Santa Fe, many American merchants start to come in. Fur trappers start to settle in, and they start to own businesses, and they become very influential. One more than anybody else, a man by the name of Charles Beaubien. Charles Beaubien, who kind of a French extraction, but essentially from St. Louis, had been a fur trapper, and he becomes very influential in that area. By the way, he changes his name from Charles to Carlos. I always joke, I said, I'm not sure he fooled anybody on that, thinking he was somehow a Latino, but nonetheless he did. So all of a sudden, and then the same thing happens out in California. what's called the hide and tallow trade out in California, where all these, the burgeoning shoe industry and the Industrial Revolution up in New England means they need hide and tallow, which they get from the vast cattle herds that are out in California at the time. And so everywhere in this northern area, the Mexican government senses that Americans are starting to kind of get their hooks in, and all of a sudden Texas flies away from Mexico. It's like, uh-oh, we got a problem here. So what they start to do is they start to give out land grants. I'm going to circle back on this in a second. But these land grants will start to come up here into the valley and into southern Colorado. What you start to have is by 1848, you have the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, the Mexican-American War of 1846-47, produces an American victory, and the Americans, they do pay for it technically, take away the whole Southwest, California, Arizona, New Mexico, Utah, Colorado, all of that becomes part of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, and parts of Texas as well. It didn't work on the land grants, but again, I'll circle back to that issue here in a second. Now you start to see the first settlements that are not Native American coming into the valley. At around 1850, 1851, some Hispanics from New Mexico move up and settle two places here, which is San Luis and Conejos down by Antonito. San Luis is considered the oldest town in Colorado. Now again, this is not counting Native Americans, but you know what we often do in American history? Don't count Native Americans. We usually disregard that. But Native Americans don't tend to have permanent, kind of settlements like what Europeans do. So San Luis, effectively the first town in Colorado here. Then you start to get, this is, by the way, I just put this up. This is actually over in the Luther Bean Museum in Richmond Hall. It's a big wall mural they have that kind of shows you the San Luis Valley, and especially kind of emphasizing that Spanish background. You see a conquistador with the helmet here. Native Americans, you see a friar. Obviously, the Spaniards with their Catholicism was always a very important element in all of this. Let's talk for a second, though. This is kind of a map of the valley here, and there's Alamosa, and we're somewhere about the O, I guess, in Alamosa County right here. Here's what I want to point out. You got San Luis down here, and you got you have Conejos right over here, right along the southern boundary of the valley. But then you got two other places worth noting. The first one is Fort Massachusetts. That's this dot here. You see it's right below Blanca and right below Mount Lindsay in that area. It's up in a canyon. It's kind of up. It's actually a beautiful area. For the last decade, up until a few years ago, my department at Adams State has been excavating old Fort Massachusetts. I have a good colleague who's now retired, Dr. Dick Goddard, and a guy you might want to ever talk to sometime about something like this too, who was conducting a field school for our students, and they were out excavating this thing. In 1852, they put up an American fort once the Americans had taken over the area here. And remember what forts are kind of designed to do. I always think that we have to, we tend to automatically assume that the American military and Native Americans are automatic enemies and they're there to fight each other. In fact, that happens many times, but in fact, many times the military was really meant to enforce treaties, and that meant keeping white people out. A lot of times a fort gets put up largely to keep white people from going past there to disrupt the provisions of the treaty, which was oftentimes preserving some key Native American land out there. And that's kind of what Fort Mass was. Fort Mass, though, is really up. If you know the valley at all, and you go to Fort Garland today, like you've taken Highway 160, and you're in Fort Garland, and right before you leave Fort Garland, it takes a little jog to the right and heads around. Kind of straight northeast of there is where Fort Massachusetts was. It's now on the Forbes Trinchera ranch out there. It's owned by Louis Bacon, one of the really rich guys in the country who has a big chunk of land out there. Is actually his foundation that provided money to do the field school that we did. And Fort Mass was there for 6 years. The problem with Fort Mass was it was kind of in a low area, and many times the soldiers of the fort had accounts, there's these ridges up above that are kind of between Fort Mass and the top of Blanca. And the Native Americans, they'd be camping above them, putting up fires and everything, which could be a little intimidating for the soldiers down there. The other thing was it's stuck in the mountains. What they did was after 6 years, they abandoned Fort Massachusetts, and then they moved it down about 8 or 10 miles. They moved it down to Fort Garland. Fort Garland, of course, is in the valley itself and makes more sense. And Fort Garland also kind of has, the main approaches coming over Levita Pass, and that seemed to be a little bit better better situated for that. So that's kind of what the early settlements of the valley look like here on all this. Let's talk about the Utes one more time. As I said, Fort Mascot's set up here to kind of protect those Hispanic settlers, and also again to kind of deal with the Utes in some ways. Many times treaty provisions came with annuities of some sort. Usually, if Indians were being asked to give up their land, usually the federal government made some kind of provisions for supplies. Certain number of head of cattle would be given to the tribe every year, since they were having their hunting lands reduced, or blankets or things of that sort. That's kind of what was happening somewhat out of Fort Garland, was kind of designed to do a little bit of that. But bottom line is the crush of settlement by Americans in particular usually mean that Native Americans are going to be in trouble down the road. This is the case. When I teach about Native Americans in the West, I always say, look, pick a tribe, any tribe you're interested in. And it's going to be a similar pattern. They go from being autonomous, free-ranging a lot of times if they're semi-nomadic or nomadic. And over the course, sometime in the 19th century, usually over the course of about a 20 to 30 year period, they find themselves from being autonomous and free-reigning to suddenly becoming greatly oppressed or essentially wards of the state on a reservation. And you can find that in Oregon, and you can find it in California, and you can find it in Arizona, you can find it in South Dakota. It's pretty much the normal pattern here. Same with the Utes. So the Utes find themselves getting squeezed in. And what really is bad news for the Utes is what happens when silver mining comes to the San Juan Mountains, because that's their territory there. And you have what's called the 1873 Bruneau Agreement, something that the Utes really are still irritated about today, because they thought they were simply giving up some mineral rights in the San Juans. What the federal authorities understood was they were seceding the entire San Juan region here. And this is what happens with the Bruneau Agreement. You can see that the Utes are still dominating most of western Colorado, but the Bruneau Agreement cuts through and it takes away the San Juan Mountains from them. And that also makes it, if you look at the Ute lifestyle, Utes typically did this. In the summer times, they headed up to the higher country. They used the mountain valleys for hunting. They could also do limited growing in certain areas. Again, they were semi-sedentary, right? They were kind of move around from year to year. This is true of a lot of the tribes in the West. In the wintertime, they would move down to the bottoms of the rivers in places like the Colorado River or the Rio Grande River here, or any of those kind of rivers where it would be a little warmer. And then they could settle down in the wintertime, stock up, put supplies in, food and things like that, and then settle in for the wintertime. And then in the summertime, head back. But that takes a lot of space. To have that kind of lifestyle, you need to have a wide range of places to be able to go on that. Well, the San Juan Mountains being denied them was a big deal. And it wasn't long. There's an incident that takes place up by White River there in northern Colorado where a man by the name of, here's a name that might ring a bell, Nathaniel Meeker. Meeker's a town, well, there's a town named after him up there. He was one of these kind of idealistic people. He came out to a colony near Greeley, Colorado to settle, and then decided he wanted to work with Indians. He moved out there. They end up massacring him and some others in that. And it leads to, whenever there's something like that, it leads the federal government to then having the excuse to then really going after the Utes. And as a result, from that time on, the Utes are pretty much going to be done in Colorado. This also shows their sequential land, there it is. You see the first one. They roam over Colorado and Utah, and then you see it in 1870s where they're greatly reduced. And now you look at it. They just have that. They have that area along the southern border and a little bit on the western border. Mostly, they have a reservation over in Utah, and that's where the Utes typically live today. On that, there's Chief Uray, one of the great minds of all that. I'm just kind of skip through. These are just a few of their other kind of showing you that territorial reduction over time. Let's shift to something else here. I'll skip past. There's Nathan Meeker. And there's the reservations today. Let's talk land grants for a minute. You guys doing okay, by the way? Yeah. Okay, gotcha. All right, so not like my students where I have to wake them up periodically, but let's talk land grants because this is really important to the Valley. So I mentioned that process where the Mexican authorities start to get worried about American encroachment with, it turns out, good reason. They're worried, they see the Americans as being expansionist and greedy and land hogging. And it turns out, you know why? Because Americans tend to be greedy and land hogging when it comes to the West that way. So they start to decide one of the strategies they could use is this. They could essentially identify private individuals who could provide settlement in areas that would create kind of a buffer with this American encroachment. And when I say individuals, what I mean is you give land grants out. You give big land grants to certain people, and you basically say, go make something happen. Go put people on the land and make it to where this Americans coming in are not, they're going to hit a wall essentially. They're going to hit a wall of settlement. Turns out the Americans, that's not going to stop the Americans coming in. But this is what starts to happen. These are land grants, as you can see, down here in southern Colorado. And one I'll point out is my personal favorite is the Maxwell land grant. That's one I've studied extensively. I did a master's thesis on Elizabethtown, New Mexico, which is a mining area that was on the Maxwell land grant. I mentioned my time working at Philmont, and I still do trainings for their staffs over there every year, and I talk a lot about the Maxwell land grant. They had the Colfax County War in the 1870s, which was a conflict over that particular land grant. Not quite as famous as the Lincoln County War because that had a star involved, Billy the Kid, but this one is still pretty significant. But what they were trying to do, and notice how those land grants are clustered, right? Because down here you have Taos. Taos is right about here, and Santa Fe is down here. And so you see what they're doing. They're trying to put up a wall of settlement over here. The way it typically worked is this. One or two people would go to the Mexican authorities, say, we want a land grant. We have an area over here we're interested in. Mexican authorities say, okay, great, we'll give you that land grant. Most of these land grants were pretty large. They would usually be at least 100,000 acres, if not more. Probably 200,000, 300,000, 400,000 acres in the case of some. Let me focus on the Maxwell land grant because this involved Carlos Charles Beaubien and a man by the name of Guadalupe Miranda. And what they did was they went and they basically got permission to settle the eastern flank of the Sangre de Cristo Mountains. Mexican government says, great, go for it. Here's what we'll do. We'll give you this chunk of land. Now, here's the thing, though. This is something you really have to understand, I think. The Mexican government, based on Spanish precedent, used to use a survey system called metes and bounds. Meet is M-E-T-E-S, metes and bounds. Metes and bounds, you know what metes and bounds is? Physical descriptions of the land. You describe the piece of land and you write it out on a deed, and that becomes your deed for that land. So we're standing here, and I might say, from where we stand, directly east to the high point visible to the east, that would be Blanca, essentially, Blanca Peak. You know, that would be one of our bounds, right? And then we get up to the Blanca, and supposedly from Blanca, you say from that high point, go south to, and you designate another point, you designate another point. Can we see any problems with this particular system? What might be the main problems?
It's not exact.
It's not exact, and it's open to interpretation. That's kind of the big thing here. So in that case, I might say I'm talking about that peak over there, but then somebody else might come along and say, "Oh no, it's that peak for Mount Lindsay further on." We can't see Mount Lindsay from here, but we know it's there, and maybe we pretend it's that. Well, guess what? All of a sudden, you've expanded. You've taken in a bunch more land. The other thing, by the way, too, land also does change. Maybe not so much out here, but I think about being from Nebraska. There's a piece of Iowa over in Nebraska because the Missouri River, cut an oxbow and changed course. But the big thing is the open to interpretation. The Maxwell land grant is going to be a good example of this. Because what happens here is Beaubien and Miranda get hold of this grant. And this is in the early 1840s. This is when a lot of this stuff is being done prior to the Mexican-American War because they're trying to prevent the Mexican-American War from happening. And it doesn't work, obviously. In the case of the Beaubien and Miranda grant, Miranda flees in front of the American Army when the American Army marches down into Santa Fe in 1846 at the first part of the Mexican-American War. That leaves Beaubien holding this grant by himself. By the way, since Beaubien was not originally a Mexican citizen, he had to have somebody to partner with. He had to have a Mexican citizen to partner with. Well, what ends up happening is Beaubien's getting older by that point. He thinks he's going to turn the grant over to his son, a man by the name of Narciso Beaubien. And unfortunately, in 1847, January of 1847, after the American takeover, there's a big uprising down around Taos. The Pueblo Indians are very upset over the American arrival here. And they end up rising up and revolting, and they kill Charles Bent, the governor of New Mexico. the Bent brothers, one of the Bent brothers, they end up killing Narciso Beaubien in that, and a number of other gringos that are in that area. Beaubien, Charles Beaubien, turns to his son-in-law, Lucian B. Maxwell, who had married one of the Beaubien daughters. Lucian B. Maxwell consolidates all this land and makes the Maxwell Land Grant. Now, I think the Maxwell Land Grant should have been much smaller than this. But what happens here is, after the Mexican-American takeover, the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo had an important provision. That provision was first of all, anybody living in that territory now becomes American citizens with all the rights and privileges being Americans. That's what leads a lot of Latinos, particularly Chicano activists later, to using that phrase, we didn't cross the border crossed us, because it's actually true. So they get full citizenship. Of course, many Latinos are going to find that actually doesn't really work out because of prejudice, and doesn't really work out for them. The other thing that happens, though, is that all previous land arrangements will be recognized. And so in this case, what it means is, this is what's going to happen. The federal government will come in over the years after the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, and remember, this is 1848, but this is going to take decades to do. Partly because you have some other things going on in the country, like the American Civil War. Kind of put some of those things back a little bit in the 1860s. So eventually what happens is there comes a process. You take a Mexican land grant, you take the deed, you set it down in front of a U.S. surveyor. And the U.S. surveyor says, because the U.S. surveyor has to translate this into the way we do it in the United States. How do we do it in the United States?
We survey it.
Survey it, we do sections, right? We have sections of 640 acres and quarter sections of 160 acres, and we have township and ranges. We put a grid on everything, is what we do past the Pennsylvania boundary. That's one of those things that I teach about. It's called the Land Ordinance of 1785. And it's always one of those, I could see my students yawning when you mention boring legislation from the past. And I'm like, but that shapes our world today. We live in the valley. When you drive out on all these county roads, guess what? They're on section lines or on quarter section lines because of a system that was set up in 1785. So what they have to do is have to translate this. But that means you have to send out these surveyors. And these surveyors go out and they look at they translate from Spanish, and then they look at these boundaries. And then they try to go ahead and put it into acre terms, into section terms and all. Well, there's a few problems with this. First of all, you have coming down into New Mexico after the American takeover. I always joke, I said it's the lowest form of American life. These dishonest, cheating people come down. We call them lawyers. That's easy, cheap shot at lawyers, right? But in fact, they include people like Thomas B. Catron. And Thomas B. Catron starts to head up something that is a very shadowy thing we call the Santa Fe Ring. And it was really a group of influential American politicians and lawyers who were really designed to try to take as much land as they possibly could in New Mexico for themselves or for business cohorts, or what we might call cronies. And here's what they also do. They tend to go and bribe the surveyors. Look, here's some extra cash. Be a little generous in the way you interpret these boundaries, kind of a thing. So the Maxwell Land Grant, I believe, should have been probably about, maybe let's just go kind of big on this. I think it should have been about 500,000 acres. It should have included most of the lands around Raton and Cimarron and Springer, New Mexico, and into the mountains down around there. But if you notice, when they blow it up, it goes over into Colorado. It includes Trinidad. It goes up to, almost up to Walsenburg. That land grant, what should have been, let's call it again, generously 500,000 acres, when it finally gets patented by the federal government later, 1.7 million acres. Way bigger. Now you might think, okay, so what? Well, guess what? There were people living on those 1.7 million acres. Many of them, good example here. Anybody ever been out west of Trinidad? If you ever drive out west of Trinidad, the Highway of Legends, Trinidad, go west, and then it ends up at the town of Levita. Very beautiful drive, by the way. There's a place called Stonewall out there, Stonewall Valley. It was full of a bunch of Hispanic settlers who had gone up there in the 1830s and 1840s. They had created farms and sheep ranches and whatnot. And all of a sudden, in the 1870s, somebody shows up saying, oh yes, you're on Maxwell Land Grant property here. Lucian B. Maxwell had sold off to an English company. You're on Maxwell Land Grant Company property, now you need to start paying us rents. And these people are like, no, this is our land. We've been here for years doing this. And they said, nope, sorry, you got to pay rents. And it creates what's called the Colfax County War. It was mostly between Latinos and these English authorities, but it also included a lot of Anglos as well. Elizabethtown, New Mexico was a mining area where a lot of the miners there were mad about this. So, but it's the process there. Understanding that process of surveying and eventually patenting could basically divest a lot of people of their property, and that's really what happened in all this. These other land grants here, pretty significant. There's the Conejos land grant. Conejos land grant included the entire southern part of the San Luis Valley. By the way, the Conejos land grant, when it goes to actually do the patent on it, you know what? It gets denied. It was basically a half century they were in the process of surveying the Conejos land grant, and finally it got to about 1900. And the federal government said, we don't have enough evidence to show that this Conejos land grant was supposed to include all this land. And so what happens is they throw that grant out, and that grant, the people living in down there, most of them tend to be Hispanic, they had to kind of then use other laws, the Homestead Act and other things, to secure property rights to their own land on that. Other ones, you can see the V. St. Vrain grant up here. This one actually gets greatly reduced in size, but you see that this really impacts southern Colorado significantly. And by the way, it doesn't impact the rest of Colorado. That also makes this area unique in that way. One last thing on land grants too. This is what I tell my students all the time. You know, we tend to think about history as these, at least my younger students do. You guys are older, and the one thing I always say about history is, I said, everybody loves history, they just don't know it yet. They haven't had it presented in a way that is actually meaningful. Or another joke, I was doing about 3 years ago, I got hired by a tech company to do a tour of Boston, where they were having a big meeting of their people. And so I was touring around Boston with them, and we did a bus tour, and then we were doing Freedom Trail and whatnot. And I got on, I said, a lot of you guys probably haven't had any history for a while, probably not since college or maybe high school. And they were all kind of nodding. I said, you probably had history in high school? And they all nodded. And I said, I know your teacher's name. And of course, these are people all over the country. They all kind of looked at me quizzically. I said, his name was Coach. Because that happens a lot, right? Coaches doing the social studies class and oftentimes not doing a very good job of it. So usually I think history is something that comes with some maturity. Once you start getting a little older and perspective on life, suddenly history becomes very important to you here. Well, the fact was, these land grants, in 2002, after I was at Adams State, there's a very important court case that was being decided over these land grants. And it had to do with the people of San Luis and access to the high country. There was an old land grant, part of that Conejos grant, that should have allowed them access to the high country. And a guy named Jack Taylor came in and bought a piece of land at the foot of the Culebras there that cut off access. And so they end up winning that. They end up winning access to that. But my point is that this is in the 21st century. We're still litigating these things. They still have an important impact. Let me slow down just for a second here. I'm going to move on to something a little bit different. But I want to go on from there for a second. Let me just stop here for a second. I've been talking a lot. Let you guys take a breath. Questions or comments over any of this?
Well, the intersection of some of the things that you're about too. I mean, my grandfather Coley, he worked the Baca land grant.
Uh-huh.
He was a custom hayer there from 1902 to when the tractors came in.
Oh yeah.
And then they ran the first store that connected the railroad on Mosca Pass. The family did.
Mm-hmm.
And so that stuff starts to tie in to the history of our family anyway.
Gotcha. Very cool. Nice. Other thoughts, comments? You know, nobody's taking notes. Didn't Carrie tell you there's going to be a final exam on this? I don't know what you guys are doing.
We've already passed.
Just kidding. You have, so. Okay, no problem. I'll keep going from there. I'm going to shift gears now a little bit. But hopefully what I've kind of done, giving you some of that Native American background, giving you some of the Hispanic background, and then this kind of unique nature of what we have down here in the valley. Now I'm going to turn attention over to something else, railroads. Actually, this is the one that I like because it's one that I've done the most work on this. Really, so by the way, there is a book that was published about 5-6 years ago called the Geology, it's got a really clumsy title. It's like Geology, Ecology, and Human History of the San Luis Valley. It was done by University of Colorado Press. You can probably buy it somewhere. You can buy it down at Narrow Gauge, I'm sure, or over at Fort Garland. Mostly it's Adams State faculty contributed to this. I contributed a chapter on the railroads, so I'll kind of talk about that aspect of it right now. I have a strong background in this. When I started studying the American West at New Mexico as a grad student, I started got interested in mining because of stuff I had done, and I did a thesis on a mining district there. And then I had to do my doctoral dissertation, and I ended up having a chance to go teach at my old hometown in Chadron, Nebraska. My father was a professor up there. They needed somebody to come in and teach, adjuncting and whatnot. Worked out great. My wife, who was not from there, my wife's originally from Cincinnati, she ended up getting her degree at Chadron State. We were living with our daughter, who was little, got to live around her grandparents for a while. It was kind of cool. But I had to figure out a dissertation topic in western Nebraska that I could do while I was teaching full time and figure out something to research. So I started studying Alliance, Nebraska. Alliance, Nebraska is a railroad town. It's actually, I think the stat is this: more coal goes through Alliance, Nebraska than any spot on earth. It's all the Powder River coal from northeastern Wyoming that come down through Alliance. When you see coal trains coming down the Front Range, that's from Alliance, that went through Alliance. They go to power plants in Texas and the Midwest and whatnot. Or you'll see the empties. If you've ever been going through on 160, sometimes you get caught by a train. Last week I managed to just beat a train that was coming through there. It was a bunch of empty coal cars heading back up north to the Powder River. So I got interested in railroads. And I decided to kind of take a look at, railroads have kind of a bad reputation in what we call the Gilded Age in the Progressive era. Railroads are like the bad boys of the American economy. They're like the robber barons, right? They're denying opportunities of people. They're gouging poor farmers who are just hardworking and find most of their profits going to railroads. Railroads they earned that reputation in the 1870s and 80s and 90s. But I was kind of interested in, okay, so we know on a macro level that the railroads are kind of bad news and whatnot, but how do people experience the railroad? That's what I wanted to know. People living on a railroad, are they naturally against the railroad? Do they hate that railroad every time they see a train coming through or whatnot? So I decided to study one town, and I studied Alliance. And so that got me into all this railroad stuff. The railroads also, I've also done this a lot. For years we had, going out of here, we had the San Luis Valley, the Rio Grande Scenic Train, and it went kind of defunct, kind of really during COVID. We had trains going over to over to Levita all the time. It was a great train trip. They would do summer concerts, which was awesome. I got to see Nitty Gritty Dirt Band, there was a pass up there where they built an amphitheater. Unfortunately, in 2018, the spring fire burned that amphitheater and burned a lot of that route. The train was still there, but now you're driving among dead trees, basically. I remember the first trip I ever did was 2019. I used to do their fall colors trains a lot. And especially Trains Magazine used to do this big tour of Colorado where you could pay and go to Denver and they'd take you to all the different railroads. And Trains Magazine used to have me do their tour on that particular train. I remember the first one I did after the fire was just depressing. It was 2018, and I was up on Levita Pass, and we're going down to Levita. It's actually Fur is the actual place where the railroad goes, a little bit south of main Levita Pass. And as we're dropping down to Levita, it was just all burned. And it was a day where it was in like early October, and it was snowing. It looked like Game of Thrones or something. It was a really weird atmosphere. It was a stark black landscape of burned trees with a heavy gray sky and then white snow falling. Really bizarre. But unfortunately, that train went out a bit. Well, the train's still there. The problem was the passenger service kind of was expensive, and it put them into receivership. That train is still there because we need a railroad in the valley, because that's how a lot of our agricultural produce gets out of the valley there. So let me talk about this for a second broadly. When I teach about the railroads in the West, I always say that the railroads are absolutely essential to understanding the American West that we have today. One of the things that we like to do, I do a public talk on this, by the way, where I do a public talk on the history of the West. And the one thing I always ask my audience is I always have my audience, I used to do this, by the way, when I'd use back in the days, we actually used a blackboard and chalk when I started teaching. Now I haven't seen a piece of chalk in 20 years. Now we use whiteboards and markers, or we use PowerPoint. But I used to do this as a public talk. I would ask my audience, I said, American West, what do we think of? And I used to write it out on the board. And now I don't have to do that. I still do this talk every now and then. I don't have to do it because I know what the audience is going to say. It's same thing. American Western history, what do you think of? Cowboys and Indians, Custer, fur traders, gold rush, building railroads, Billy the Kid, outlaws. And it's the same list every time. And then I ask everybody, and I'll ask you guys this, When we think about the American West, what's the one name that you think of? What one person, more than anybody else, seems to be the American West? Don't be afraid to say it. I know what you're thinking. Somebody's thinking it. What's it? Nope. You know what the answer usually is almost always? John Wayne. Right. John Wayne. That's why I said don't be afraid to say it. You know, it's like, no, I'm going to sound silly if I'm doing a movie actor here. No, it's John Wayne. And actually that makes a lot of sense. But my point about that is, though, is that first of all, what everybody talks about with what they think of the history of the American West falls in about a 50-year period. It's usually from about the 1830s to about the 1880s. It's the gold rush. It's all that. Usually the fur trade might kind of stretch that a little bit earlier. But otherwise, in other words, if we go to any other part of the country, some of you guys live in other parts of the country, if we go to any other part of the country, would we conceive our history so narrowly? If we were living in Virginia, you know, we would probably talk about the colonial period, we'd talk about the Revolution, we'd talk about the Civil War for sure. We'd also probably talk about the Civil Rights Movement of the 1950s. You know, we would conceive it much more broadly if we did this in Massachusetts or other places. But here in the West, it's that little niche that everybody likes to focus on, the fun West, the frontier West. That they like to. And then John Wayne kind of fits that. But the other thing about John Wayne, the reason people usually think about him, is this term that I always kind of cringe when I hear it, rugged individualism. The reason I cringe at that is because as a historian, this is largely a myth. The fact is that when you talk about the American West, it's not individual pioneers that are really making the big difference in the West. It's what I call the twin pillars of Western development, big government and big business. People don't like to hear that because that's not sexy, right? That doesn't tell us good things about America that we like to tell stories about in the American West. But unfortunately, it's really true. You know, the federal government is the one who comes in, buys the land, clears the land, surveys the land, clears the land of Native Americans. When pioneers move out west and they find they don't have enough water, federal government builds dams for them. When they need a railroad, the government subsidizes the railroads that come out. And then the other thing is big business, big mining companies, big railroad companies. They are really essential. Now, the whole notion of individualism is still important. It's still a factor, but I don't think it's really the dominant factor. But it's the one that we like to isolate when we tell stories about the United States and about the West. So let's take a look at railroads here. By the way, railroads in the West, you might know, this is something that most people don't know much about. The Pacific Railway Act of 1862, supplemented in 1864. By the way, anybody know what was going on in 1862 and 64? The Civil War is going on. You know what's really fascinating was in the 1850s, the South, the southern states, were very obstructionist. They were trying to prevent the government from doing almost anything because, and if anyone wants to argue with me after this, I'll be happy to, the Civil War is 100% about slavery. I know they'll say states' rights. No, the only thing that it really mattered when it came to states' rights was the protection of slavery. And so the South was really trying to make sure that nothing could pass Congress because they didn't want anything to really pass Congress because then Congress, with its growing northern majority, could start to move against slavery. And so nothing happened in the 1850s as a result of that. Well, guess what happened? 1860, Lincoln gets elected, South starts to secede, 1861, the war begins. You know what the Congress does? They basically get the war going, make sure they get all set up, and then in 1862 they start passing all the legislation they couldn't pass when the South was hanging around. They pass a Homestead Act. They pass the Morrill Land Grant Act, which sets up a system of publicly funded colleges to try to promote agricultural and mechanical types of trades. Almost every school with state in the title is usually a land grant school. New Mexico State, Colorado State, Kansas State, Utah State, Penn State, all land grant colleges. And then they pass this. The South had prevented this from happening because the South wanted a southern route. Everybody knew, by the way, California became a state in 1850. You're going to have to link the two. A railroad was the way to do that. But everybody knew that there's no way one railroad company would ever go and be foolish enough to try to do this. Way too expensive. You're talking about deferred profits for decades down the road. The market was not going to build a transcontinental railroad. The only way it would be built is through some kind of major subsidies here, and that's what they did with the Pacific Railway Act of 1862. This act said we got two railways we're going to charter here. One's going to be the Central Pacific out of Sacramento, the other's going to be the Union Pacific out of Omaha, and we'll start subsidizing them. It also provided for very generous, low interest and long deferred loans per mile of track. When you built a mile of track in a place like Nebraska, the government would then give you $16,000 for that 1 mile of track that wouldn't have to be paid off for decades to come. And again, very low interest. Once you got to western Nebraska and into Wyoming, it became $32,000 per mile. Now the Central Pacific coming out of Sacramento, they're building up through the Sierra Nevada range. Theirs was $48,000 per mile. So you had that, $16, $32, $48,000 per mile. But the big thing they got was land grants. And so what they did was that for each mile of track forward, the railroads got 10 sections of land, 10 square miles of land for every 1 mile of track built. In 1864, you know what they do? They double that to 20 square miles of land. So the railroad built 1 mile of track and it gets 20 square miles of land given to them to do whatever they want with. And I mentioned the checkerboard fashion here. So what they typically did was they gave it in checkerboard fashion, because here's the theory. Back in the 1860s, public land was understood as our land, we the people's land. And it would be hard to justify giving all that land to private corporations. So by giving it a checkerboard fashion, the theory was then you would double the value of the land of the sections that the government retained, and they could sell that for more money, and the people would not be out anything. But you'd then have the happy circumstance of now a railroad's going through to develop that area, if that's your goal. So that's what happened on that. By the way, I'll digress. I always tell a couple little incidents about this. It's funny because sometimes the railroads were building and they couldn't always claim that land. A good example is the Santa Fe Railroad. The Santa Fe Railroad they get in on the 1864 Amended Act, and the Santa Fe Railroad's building through Kansas, and eventually when they get to New Mexico, guess what? They build to Lamy, New Mexico. They actually don't go to Santa Fe. They have to build near Santa Fe. Then they go down to Albuquerque, and along there, the Santa Fe Railroad can get almost no land. How come? What's between Albuquerque and Santa Fe? A lot of Indian reservation. Actually, if you drive down that stretch of interstate, there's a lot of casinos. And that tells you that there's Native Americans nearby, because in the early 1990s, Native Americans were given the ability to game. I think it was on the Daily Show once I saw that one of their correspondents was talking about this and said, casino, which is an Indian word meaning makes up for everything else. But you have a lot of casinos along there. That means all those lands, Isleta Pueblo, Santo Domingo Pueblo, none of those weren't able to get any land. So what the government would do is the government would give essentially the Santa Fe Railroad a big stack of IOUs by the hundreds and hundreds, and basically give them to the railroad and say, go find some land somewhere else and claim it. And so as a result, a lot of these railroads would go off and they'd find coal lands away from their railroads and they'd claim those, these are called indemnity claims. It's fascinating because in the 1920s, I was doing a research project on Raton, New Mexico. I found a lawyer in Raton in the 1920s who was still selling indemnity claims left over. In other words, the railroads had so much land, they couldn't even begin to use it all, and they couldn't begin to dispense of it all. Railroad grants they end up being more land than the Homestead Act. So that's another reason I say about the twin pillars of Western development, big business, big government. By the way, here's a really fascinating little footnote to this. In 1980, Mount St. Helens blew up, if those of you guys remember. I was living in Chadron, and I remember we got, ash coming down on us in Chadron as a result. But when Mount St. Helens blew up, I don't know if you've ever been there, it's now Mount St. Helens National Volcanic Park, and it's really fascinating. It looks like a lunar landscape, but it obviously just destroyed dozens and hundreds of square miles right around there. And when the government decided to create Mount St. Helens National Volcanic Park, they had to consolidate the land claims. Now, most of those land claims were, of course, now worthless. Many of them were below dozens of feet of ash and lava or whatever, so it was pretty much worthless. Usually these people signed their deeds over, got a little stipend from the government, that was it. Here's what's really fascinating. They found out that the summit of Mount St. Helens was actually owned by, of all people, of all groups, the Burlington Northern Railroad owned the summit of Mount St. Helens. Now, by the way, the summit of Mount St. Helens was no longer there. It was now in Yakima and Spokane and Billings, Montana. It had been blown all these. But it was fascinating. What the Burlington Northern Railroad did was they just donated. They just signed their deed over. How did the Burlington Northern Railroad come to own the summit of Mount St. Helens? Burlington Northern Railroad was founded in 1970 as a result of merger of three major railroads, the Northern Pacific, Great Northern, and Chicago, Burlington, Quincy. And it turns out the Northern Pacific had one of these land grants, and they had an indemnity claim, and just for the hell of it, they slapped it down on the summit of Mount St. Helens years and years and years before. So it tells you that these railroads are influencing things far away from their actual tracks. And that's going to be the case here as well. What's that?
Yeah, we'll stop at 10:30 and we go 30-minute break after that.
Oh,
You okay?
yeah.
Okay, gotcha.
Step out.
Then I'll just finish this up really fast and spend a few minutes on this, because I do want you to understand this when you look at the valley. The railroads are really the primary determinant of everything that's in the valley nowadays. This is William Jackson Palmer. He was the head of the Denver and Rio Grande Western Railroad. Palmer, very influential person in Colorado history, as you probably know, because if you go to Colorado Springs, everything is named Palmer. There's Palmer High School and the Palmer Divide and Lewis Palmer High School, and everything's Palmer up in there. There's a big statue of Palmer that makes for a really, really annoying intersection down there in the middle of Colorado Springs. But the fact is that he created the DNRG Railroad, and they were designed to be a little bit different philosophy. All these railroads were building east to west. And Palmer decided that there should be a north to west, north-south railroad that could take advantage of business and connect some of these railroads. He also decided it would be in the mountains. He also decided it would be narrow gauge. You know, the standard gauge is 4 feet, 8.5 inches. Narrow gauge is 3 foot, but narrow gauge can be built a lot cheaper. The locomotives are smaller. Everything, you can turn curves tighter. You can actually go up and down grades a little steeper. It actually is good for the mountains there. And so he starts to build a north-south railroad coming out of Denver, really out of Colorado Springs was effectively its headquarters. And the idea was he was going to kind of create a different business model on all that. Unfortunately, part of his plan was to eventually go to Mexico City. So he starts building down the Front Range, and then he runs into the Santa Fe Railroad, who's busy building out across Lamar and that area in southern Colorado. And they get to Raton Pass, and they start competing for Raton Pass. And they start competing in another way as well, which is they start competing over for the Royal Gorge. The Santa Fe Railroad, Leadville starts to pop up. Santa Fe Railroad starts to build up the Royal Gorge as the Rio Grande was, and they get in this big conflict. They actually have fights between their grading crews over this. And finally, what they do is they settle it with something called the Treaty of Boston. The reason they call it the Treaty of Boston, the Santa Fe corporate headquarters were actually in Boston. So they sit down and they decide how they're going to divide the territory up. And they decide that the Santa Fe Railroad is going to get Raton Pass, and it's going to get New Mexico and go on out to LA or out to California. The Rio Grande is going to get Colorado. They're going to get the Royal Gorge route, and then they're going to get Colorado. But think about this for a second. The Treaty of Boston, this is a hugely impactful piece of a thing that happens, and it has nothing to do with the American government. And by the way, there's nobody that gets a say in it except for the corporate heads of these two corporations. I think it's really interesting that way. So the Rio Grande gets to come into the mountains, and they end up building the route over to us today. Here's what I want to kind of focus on, though. There's the Royal Gorge route that you can still take today, and fascinating to go do. That's one of my favorite places. That's still there, by the way, the Hanging Bridge. The Royal Gorge is so narrow at one point. It's a little bit to the west of the Royal Gorge Bridge that goes above, that they had to build this situation where they had to put girders in to suspend the bridge from it. And it's still there today. Last year, we took our grandkids and they have a Polar Express type train that goes in there, and you go up to the Hanging Bridge, and then the train backs up and goes back down to Canyon City. This is the difference, by the way. There's a standard gauge versus a narrow gauge train. And you know what the Valley had? The Valley had both. Once they built into Alamosa in the 1880s, it doesn't take long before they realize this narrow gauge thing has some real disadvantages. It means that if you're going to try to transfer from one railroad to another, you got to take everything off those trains and put them onto smaller cars. So they narrow gauge. By 1900, they standard gauge the track into Alamosa and down to Antonito. And what you really have in the valley for a long time is what's called dual gauge. And here's an example. There's kind of the general map, and we are right down. There's Alamosa. There's the train coming over. And then it drops down to Antonito, and then it eventually goes out to Durango and Silverton. And then there's a funny little line that people love to talk about called the Chili Line, and it's a little line that runs down to Embudo, New Mexico. It's kind of a very colorful little line along there. But there is, I have here a picture of, there's dual gauge track. And you can see there's the narrow gauge and then there's the outside rail, so you can run both kinds of trains on it. It was dual gauge track from Alamosa all the way down to Antonito. And it was that way until the 1960s, actually. Here's what I want to think about for the valley here for just a second, and go back to my map that I had. Let's see where I have that. I guess I have a little bit further on here. There's the valley. That's kind of the schematic of the valley. And there you can see is Alamosa, and you look around here. We live in a very flat valley, obviously. That means there's not really natural barriers to this stuff. Before the railroad came, you really still only had Conejos and San Luis. The railroad comes in and sets up all these towns. And, you know, usually the standard distance that railroads like to have between station stops, particularly for water, there's two numbers that are kind of operable here. One is 15 miles and the other is 7.5 miles. They like to have water tanks every 7.5 miles in case a train's going through a lot of steam and it needs more water. But 15 miles was really critical. You had to really have a station stop every 15 miles. This had to do partly with farming. 15 miles was a reasonable, that could service the farms along a given area there. And it had to do also with you wanting to have sidings, for example, so trains could pass each other on single track. But if you think about it, that 15 miles is kind of important here. For example, Alamosa to Monte Vista, how far is that? 15 miles. Alamosa to Mosca, 15 miles. About 15, call it, give or take. Alamosa to La Jara? La Jara to Antonito? Monte Vista to Del Norte? You know, you're seeing a pattern, 15 miles. In other words, the way the towns are laid out here in the valley are pretty much the function of the railroads. 15 miles, or 7.5. Estrella, you know, the little tiny siding that's between La Jara and Alamosa is 7.5 miles. I want to mention one last thing, and then we'll take a break here. I also want to mention this. This is something that I think people realize too, that railroads had a lot to do with the way towns look, especially in the American West. Now in the East, towns were already settled. And the railroads had to figure out ways to slide their railroads in there and then be able to service those areas. In the West, the railroads are setting these things up. Typically what happened is the railroads would use one of their sections if they had a land grant. By the way, the Rio Grande did not have one of those land grants. All they were given was a 100-foot right-of-way. Wherever they wanted to go, they could get a 100-foot right-of-way. And then they had to kind of figure it out. But you know what? Here's the thing. If you're building a railroad, you know where you're going. So what you can do is in advance, go ahead and go out and claim some land. And then when you start building your railroad, you show up, guess what? You control that piece of land. And then you can sell off the lots. What railroads typically did, everything in the American West, was they set up what are called T-town forms. This is the track right through here, and you can see businesses on each side of a track. The only problem with it is we forget how busy railroads are and how dangerous they are. People, man, I ended up studying safety on the railroads. People are getting killed all the time by trains, you know, back in the day. Still are, but way less than they used to be. And then you could have this, or what you could maybe do is organize your business district to where it would just cross the tracks, you know, once or something this way. But this is what became the norm, a T-town. You have a track here, and what you do is you put one street going straight away perpendicular to the track. That would be State Street in Alamosa. And then usually 1 or 2 blocks up, you put another street and you make the lot small. That becomes your commercial district. That's why it's a T. Think about all the towns in the West. Shatter, Nebraska, where I grew up. 3rd and Main is the T of the T-town. Alliance, Nebraska, Box Butte in Maine Box Butte and 2nd Street is the T. Every town is set up this way. Here in the valley, La Jara is pretty much that way. Antonito is kind of that way. It's a little different. Alamosa is a little weird because of the way the river sort of pinches all of that. But otherwise, you can kind of see it. I challenge you to start thinking about towns, you know, especially out on the Great Plains, where if a railroad set up a town, it was a T-town. And you know what that also did? That also created this concept called the other side of the tracks. What does the other side of the tracks imply?
No investment.
No investment. It usually implies somebody from a lower social standing, you know, oh, he married a girl from the other side of the tracks. It usually means working class. Here in Alamosa, you can see it. Drive south of the tracks. It's the older section of town. The houses are smaller, especially the old houses, because they were meant. In fact, I have a picture of it right here. There's looking up at the T. That's the railroad station, obviously, that now is the Chamber of Commerce Center there, or the Visitor Center. And you can see looking up to the T here. And then this is the south side of town in Alamosa. Look at those tiny little houses. They all look like they're from the 1880s or 90s because they are. And more of your vice and crime would get relegated to that side of town. Prostitution, gambling, illegal drinking, would all take place over there, which has kind of become, and it's still the case in Alamosa today, isn't it? For the most part, for those of you who have been around. But it's certainly true of other towns as well. Again, growing up in Shatter, Nebraska, there was a section of town called Kenwood, and it was the other side of the tracks. And I know that, they had an elementary school over there, and then in middle school, the kids from Kenwood would then suddenly join us over at the middle school. And it was always kind of seen as, I'm not sure those distinctions ever disappeared, even as you progress through high school on that. Thank you, guys.
Thanks, Richard.
Yeah, no problem.